Dolly, where I come from, would I have called you a hillbilly?
If you had of, it would have been something very natural, but I would have probably kicked your shins or something. No, actually.
But when I think of hillbillies, am I thinking of your kind of people?
I think you probably are. The people that grew up where I was were the ones that you would consider the little Abner people, Daisy May and that sort of thing. They took that kind of thing from people like us, but we were very proud people with a lot of class. It was country class, but it was a great deal of class, and most of my people were not that educated, but they are very, very intelligent. Good common sense, horse sense we called it.
Happy holidays, political junkies. As I said on the Substack, we're going to change up the next 3 weeks. Neil is off on a holiday vacation, but we've got some terrific book podcasts lined up for you, each one with a short news summary. Neil and I will be back and ready to rock on January 9th to evaluate what fresh hell is breaking loose in 2026. So we began this episode with a clip from a 1977 Barbara Walters interview in which Dolly Parton skillfully parries a stereotype about white people who grew up poor in the American South. That's the introduction to an episode today with historian Martha Ackman, who's written a new biography of Dolly Parton. Ain't Nobody's Fool, The Life and Times of Dolly Parton. But before we get to Martha and our fabulous conversation about one of the great country music stars in the United States, let's go to the news. The man who right-wing influencer Milo Yiannopoulos has called the most ostentatiously useless and embarrassing government employee in the history of the nation. That's right, we're talking about Deputy Director of the FBI, Dan Bongino. Well, Bongino has resigned as of January, although sources say his office is now empty. Bongino expressed deep satisfaction earlier this month after the FBI arrested a suspect in the January 6th pipe bombing case. He said he pressed the Bureau to solve the case and got regular updates from the lead investigator. Now, this is what we hear from Kara Leonig and Ken Delanian, writing at MS Now. But as a podcaster, Bongino had stoked conspiracy theories that the pipe bombs were a false flag operation. When asked by Fox's Sean Hannity about the discrepancy, he said that, and I quote, "As a podcaster, he was paid to give his opinions, but now at the FBI, he was paid to be your deputy director, and we base investigations on facts." Okay, so spreading conspiracy theories is not a big deal if you're just broadcasting to millions of people. Rumor has it that Bongino is returning to podcasting, where he will be more familiar with the terrain. In a second piece of news, this week saw furor about a two-part profile of Trump Chief of Staff Susie Wiles by Chris Whipple of Vanity Fair. Wiles, a political consultant who is normally very backstage, let drop a number of very frank comments about the president and the clown car that surrounds him. The outrage has been predictable, except for White House attacks on photographer Christopher Anderson, which none of us anticipated. His close-ups are incredibly famous at Vanity Fair, and one of those close-ups was of Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, whose lip gloss did not conceal injection marks, presumably from a cosmetic procedure. I mean, it was a cosmetic procedure, and the White House is angry that the photographs were not retouched, but the whole point of a Christopher Anderson photograph is that it's not retouched. And in a final piece of news that we're very grateful for, the shooter in the Brown University case has been found, a suicide in a storage unit in New Hampshire. It can't get weirder and sadder than that. Apparently the same guy is also the person who murdered a professor at MIT. Our sympathies at the podcast lie wholly with the victims of this terrible, terrible tragedy. And we hope in 2026 there's going to be some shift in this country's tolerance for gun ownership and its lack of attention to mental health. So I want to shift right now to Martha Ackman, whose book, Ain't Nobody's Fool, let's repeat it again, The Life and Times of Dolly Parton, is coming out on December 30th. Now there's going to be a link on the podcast to order this book, to pre-order it, and I talk about that a little bit in the podcast, why pre-ordering is so important. And let's go straight to the interview. Martha Ackman, welcome to the show.
Hi, Claire. Good to be with you.
Well, Joe, you probably don't know this, but I adore Dolly Parton for some of the same reasons I'm sure all of her fans do. She's kind and generous and smart and a wonderful artist, and she does terrific things. But your book, Ain't Nobody's Fool, The Life and Times of Dolly Parton, gives us a full biography of this amazing woman. Can you tell us what drew you to Dolly's life?
Well, I guess at the very, very beginning, I remember being at my grandparents' home in St. Louis, and this is way back when Dolly was on the Porter Wagner show, and I remember seeing her for the first time on the Porter Wagner show. And something about her both captivated and mystified me. Captivated me, I enjoyed her, I enjoyed the music, I enjoyed her humor. Mystified, she didn't quite seem to be what she was projecting. There seemed to be something more there. So, years go on and I write other books. I write books about women who've changed America is kind of the tagline, but the straightforward way of saying that is I like women who know their own minds. And I just always had Dolly on the back burner. And so I decided the time was right to do it, that there hadn't been a biography of Dolly Parton in many, many years. Her autobiography even was almost 30 years old. So it just seemed to finally get back to that original question, what is captivating and mystifying about Dolly Parton?
Yeah, and there's a real parallel to another one of your books about the one you wrote about Emily Dickinson, because both Dolly and Emily Dickinson, first of all, great artists who changed the art world that they were enmeshed in, but they're also two people that really guarded their privacy. So let's begin, if you can tell us Dolly's story, a kind of capsule biography for listeners.
Well, Dolly was always musical from the time she was a toddler and kind of banging on pots and hearing geese. She talks about the call of geese kind of stayed in her mind. And she sang in her grandfather's Pentecostal church in Sevierville, Tennessee. That's East Tennessee, just in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. And she and her sisters began joining her, and they became quite popular. They sang in other churches. Dolly continued to sing and push. She had, from the very beginning, this very clear sense of what she wanted to do, that she wanted to be a songwriter, she wanted to be a performer, she wanted to be a star, as she said. She started appearing on the Cass Walker Farm and Home Hour, a radio program and television program there in East Tennessee. And boy, that's a story. That was kind of the last of the medicine shows, actually. And she became noticed and began singing at openings of grocery stores and things like that. She graduated high school in 1964, and the very next day went to Nashville and stayed with an uncle for a period of time. And she didn't get hired. She knocked on doors and tried to be hired as a songwriter, tried to be hired as a singer. Those who were evaluating her as a singer said she sounded like a screech owl. And then finally somebody took a chance on her, and that gave her some attention. Her big break was Porter Wagner, the biggest country music television show in the country at that time. In 1967, she was there for 7 years, and that really taught her a lot about performing. She was very grateful to Porter. She was also fighting tooth and nail with him because she outgrew him, and her creativity really eclipsed him, and they had a very, very difficult parting. But that's when she separated. That's when she began to cross over into more popular forms of music. Then along comes the television show. Along comes the movie career, and Dolly was on her own then. And I think that's the Dolly Parton that most people think of. Dollywood comes later. The story goes on and on.
Well, we're going to come back to Porter Wagoner because he was kind of a piece of work on wheels. But I also want to come back to Dolly being enmeshed in her family, in her community. The Partons were extremely poor. Her father was illiterate, which I did not know. And it really sort of speaks to that later in life project she's had of getting books to young people and so that they can own books.
Right.
But the family's poverty was very difficult, and she never really has complained about it, and it seems to have, in a way, bound them together, whereas other families' poverty can kind of drive people apart. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yes, they were very, very poor. They didn't have running water. They didn't have telephone. They lived in a whole string of cabins that were insulated by newspapers that they tacked to the wall. It was very, very difficult circumstances, as it was for many people around in that area. But Dolly looks upon that time, her childhood and then young adulthood, high school, that sort of thing, as the wellspring of her imagination. It was both difficult, but it was also something that informed the way she saw the world. I kind of tend to think of that in terms of nature. I mean, it's a gorgeous, beautiful area, but it's also an area where floods and lightning and tornadoes can come through and rip it all up. So Dolly wrote a song kind of early on in her career about everything is beautiful in its own way. And that speaks to both, those floods and the natural beauty around her. So, when I was writing this book, I kind of played a little game with myself and said, could Dolly Parton have been Dolly Parton if she was born in Wyoming and grew up in Wyoming? And I think the answer to that is no. That environment really, really did inform who she was. And also, in terms of the poverty, just think of one of her most famous songs, A Coat of Many Colors. That definitely comes from that beginning when they didn't have money to have a winter coat.
Yeah. And it seems like her parents also encouraged them to think about these hardships as things that could not just be overcome, but were part of who they were, and that these were honorable characteristics to have.
Yes, and creativity was so important to the Parton family. Dolly talks about being a kid and making little houses out of moss and whatever was whatever was around in the yard, and her mother would come out and bring dinner, kind of encourage their play acting. Her brothers speak of that as well. They talk about the joys of pretending. And so that the emphasis on being able to imagine and being able to use what is around you was very central to them.
Yeah. And it seems like the family was also kind of a refuge because the Parton children were not always well treated by others. They weren't always well treated by their teachers. They weren't always well treated by their peers. And that their poverty became a kind of stigma. I mean, it's kind of interesting because the kids who didn't treat them well were only marginally more prosperous, but
right.
they held it over them and so on. And yet Dolly does not seem to have been traumatized by this.
Well, I'd say yes and no. I mean, she certainly was traumatized when she was bullied wearing that actual coat of many colors to school. As a matter of fact, she didn't even tell her mother about that until years and years later. She kind of kept it inside her.
Right.
High school was really difficult for Dolly. That's when she was. I don't mean difficult academically. She was very bright, but she put all of her attention into her music. But that's when she was playing on the Cass Walker Show. And this is 1964. It's the Beach Boys. It's the Beatles. And there's Dolly with her guitar slung around her back. And And teachers made fun of her. Not a lot, I don't think, but some. But her cousin told me a story of one time they were in PE class. Dolly hated PE class. She didn't like to sweat publicly, she said. And they were sitting on the bleachers getting ready to play. I think it was volleyball or something like that. And there were city kids behind them. The school really did have a divide between the country kids that kind of had to come on the bus and ate whatever their mother prepared for them that day, if they were lucky. And then the Sevierville kids who ate in the school cafeteria. And so there were some of the city kids, the town kids behind her. And they were teasing Dolly and her cousin. And they were talking about the bologna sandwiches that they always ate. And the cousin said they just sat there and kind of took it and didn't turn around and snap. They just in some ways rose above it. A lot of comments from Dolly's teachers talk about Dolly kind of rising above any fuss, just didn't confront it, didn't make an issue out of it, just rose above it. So yeah, it was hard for them. And it's amazing that one of the first efforts of philanthropy that Dolly did was to give back to the schools, that were so difficult for her.
Well, she's a remarkably generous person, and the kind of person that I think of as Christian with a small c. That, all of those virtues that are supposed to be inherent in Christianity, she seems to display them just naturally.
Very, very much so. I mean, this is a woman who knows the Bible forwards and backwards. She didn't continue on with her grandfather's Pentecostal faith. That wasn't her best expression. I like your notion of the small c. She speaks a lot about one particular scripture, judge not lest you be judged. And I think that is at the core of who she is, core of her own philosophy of being in the world. I think it's part of her being such a unifying figure, certainly. But she took a lot away from that upbringing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had forgotten about the Pentecostalism. I had a great aunt who was Pentecostal, and one of the reasons she was that women were better respected in the Pentecostal church. And of course, I'm thinking of Amy Semple McPherson, who had a leadership role as a Pentecostal. So I sort of wonder if some of Dolly's self-confidence and sense of herself as inherently equal, even if people were not treating her that way, might also have been founded in her religion.
Well, I think she took exception to the way that the church, at least in her area, treated women. I think they couldn't cut their hair, they couldn't wear makeup. I mean, that was a big issue for Dolly. She was beginning to experiment with makeup at that time. And I think she saw a subservience there that she did not cotton to.
Yeah, and it's interesting how she just sort of makes her own way. She doesn't argue with people about things. I mean, I've noticed this about LGBT issues. I was in Nashville about a year ago, and there was a huge fuss about Dolly Parton having come out to support LGBT people. And there were chalkings all over the streets of Nashville of people saying, what would Dolly do? You do that, and but she had not actually come out in an advocacy position. She doesn't do politics, but she had basically come out and said, why would we treat people badly because of who they are? And so there's this very straightforward approach to equality and kindness.
Yeah.
So Dolly graduates from high school. She gets on a bus to go to Nashville, and she's got her guitar. She's got a box of dirty clothes because she wants to get out of there so fast. She doesn't have time to wash her clothes. And she ends up in Nashville. And at a certain point, when she's in the wishy-washy, she sees this boy who just knocks her for a loop. And it's Carl Dean. Tell us about that moment.
I was very fortunate to find the person who was with Carl Dean when he first laid eyes on Dolly Parton. So Dolly was staying with her uncle, and as you said, she had all these dirty clothes, and she had to go down to the wishy-washy, as Nashvillians call a laundromat. And so she walked down the block, and Carl was with an old high school buddy of his. They had graduated high school. Dickie had this apartment, and he had a wonderful sense of humor, and people liked him, but he was very shy, and especially around girls. And so Dickie said, they were kind of watching Dolly, and Dickie said, Carl, you ought to go out there and talk to her. And apparently that was too much. He couldn't go out on the sidewalk, but he thought maybe he could get in his car and kind of drive around and the laundromat, and maybe she would pop out. And indeed, that's what happened. Dolly must have thrown her dirty clothes into the laundry and came out and sat outside and was drinking a soda. And he rolled down the window. And Dolly threw up her hand. That's what she did. That's in Sevierville. They always throw up their hands. And so then Carl got the nerve to just say, well, it looks like you're out there in the sun. You might get a little sunburn. Anyway, that's how it started. And she was babysitting her uncle's new child, and Carl would kind of come over, and they'd sit on the porch and talk a little bit. But things moved along quite rapidly on Carl's end. He thought, I found the woman I'm going to marry. Dolly had very specific ideas about what she wanted to do, and so she had to put the brakes on it a little bit. But that was their encounter, right there among the dirty clothes. And thank goodness for Carl's old pal Dickie. They stayed friends their entire lives, and little did Dickie know that he was introducing Carl Haldane to Dolly Parton, and they would have a relationship for almost 60 years.
And Dolly also had to keep her relationship and then marriage to Carl a secret for a rather prolonged period. And this sort of gets us into the territory of how she was treated as a woman, that there were very specific rules about what you were supposed to sound like, what you were supposed to look like, being sort of subservient to these men who had the big shows. And that brings us back to Porter Wagoner, who is a big star in Nashville, has a national television show, and Dolly gets on his show. How does that happen?
Well, she was on a record label. She had a record out. Her first big hit was Dumb Blonde, not written by Dolly, and interestingly enough. But it's a cheeky kind of song about, you may think I'm dumb and I'm blonde, but this is where I got the title from my book. I'm not dumb, I'm not blonde. This dumb blonde ain't nobody's fool. That song fit her like a glove because it got to, that undercurrent of she's no dunce, certainly. So she had some success, and Porter Wagoner was losing his girl singer, as they called them at the time, and she was moving back to Oklahoma and had an opening. And then Porter says one thing, Dolly says another. Dolly said Porter called her up and said, why don't you come and audition? Porter says no. She came knocking on the door and said, I want to be considered. We don't know exactly what happened, but she won it. She won the audition. And Porter was particularly struck by what he called a blood harmony to their voices, that they sounded almost related. There was some kind of DNA that really made their singing quite wonderful. So I think I mentioned earlier that Porter said, can you give me 5 years? And he said, we need that amount of time to kind of get you accepted. And so Dolly ended up staying 7 years with him. And boy, they worked hard. I mean, they not only was there the television show, but there were records that they produced. They did a lot of duets, and they were on the road just constantly. So it was Dolly on the bus with the Wagon Masters, Porter Wagon's Wagon Masters, and she ended up staying 7 years. But it was both, I think, the most creative time of her beginning of her career in terms of songwriting. I mean, she writes Jolene, she writes I Will Always Love You, but it was also extremely difficult because of the way Porter and Dolly locked horns.
Yeah. And I want to get back to that in a second, but I also want to say to our listeners, Dolly Parton was writing music all the time. She was writing it on the back of laundry tickets. She was just writing. And I actually heard years ago that she has this vast library of songs that even she has never recorded, that she's made available to young people who are coming up in the business to record and sort of try and get ahead with a little bit of Dolly on their demos, which is extraordinarily generous. I mean, it fits. But there's also something else with Porter Wagoner, and I wonder if we could dig into it a little bit, because they have a lot of conflict with each other. And the woman who preceded Dolly, we actually never hear from her again, but Porter Wagoner was married to a woman from whom he was separated. He was having an affair with that woman who preceded Dolly.
Right.
Again, the story as well, did they come to an amicable parting of the ways? Had he promised to marry her and not come through with it? We don't really know. But my question is, a lot of that conflict, and particularly the ways in which Porter Wagoner seemed to be very bitter after Dolly left him, suggests that maybe he wanted some things from her that she didn't want to give. And you don't really say that in the book, but I was left with that impression.
Yeah, no, I would not agree with that interpretation.
Okay.
Porter thought that he was the king of the hill, and when Norma Jean Beasler, that's the woman he was having the affair with, his girl singer, and she left. One of his first meetings with Dolly, he asked Carl to be there as well, incorrectly thinking that in that marriage that Carl would make all the decisions. Little did he know, that they made decisions together, and Dolly made quite a few of her own decisions. But one of the first things he said was, now, there's going to be a lot of rumors about any time I'm with a woman singer, they think we're having an affair, and that goes for Minnie Pearl and Kitty Wells, and he was naming off women that most people would not think Porter would be involved with, and he wasn't involved with those women. But anyway, he had a very inflated sense of his own attractiveness, and so it was just odd, to say that at the very beginning instead of like, how many songs will I do a show? Let's talk about costumes, that kind of thing. But Dolly got red hot mad when people suggested that there was something romantic between herself and Porter Wagoner. Again, I had talking to some of her family and friends, and they remembered a time when she was in the local Sevierville hospital visiting somebody, and an old high school mate raised that question, and said, Dolly, is it true that you're having? And she just got spitting mad about that. And I think it's in part because it insulted her. You don't think I can make it on my own, that I have to be involved with Porter Wagoner to do so. So no, that is not my interpretation. Many people thought that because of the kinds of songs they sang. They did what were called fight and scratch songs, where they play kind of like a bickering couple. A little bit of flirting, a little bit of back, kind of mean back and forth, that sort of thing. Also, I know I ran across this, to speak to your point about this. They did all their own commercials for the Porter Wagoner show, and people of a certain age might remember they advertised for Breeze laundry detergent, and there was a real thin towel in every box of Breeze laundry detergent. And somebody wrote in to the newspaper and said, that Porter Wagoner and Dolly Parton, when they're doing those Breeze advertisements, they look like husband and wife. It's disgusting the way that they are flirting back and forth. So, people really added fuel to the fire.
My impression was much more that Porter Wagoner was putting the moves on her, and she was saying no. Not that actually they were flirting with each other, but that he really didn't like not being in control of that situation. And Dolly recently did an interview with Dan Rather in which she talked about the balance she had to have in Nashville between being herself and actually using her beauty and her charm to get ahead, but also not letting people take advantage of her. And that it was a very sort of thin line to tread. What was your impression of that?
Well, as I said before, I don't think that Porter Wagoner was putting the moves on Dolly Parton. If he did, she shut that down pretty fast. She and again, I think she would think it was insulting that she couldn't be taken seriously. Other people thought that. Dolly plays off of her image. She calls herself a cartoon of a woman, big hair, certainly in the early years, heavy makeup, the very curvaceous figure. She says that gives me something to work off of because I look one way and I am another. So I have to try hard and I surprise people, and people think they're going to get a bimbo when they see me until I start singing the songs that are really going to captivate them. But so she has used that cartoon of a woman idea almost her entire life. I mean, she's toned it down now, but certainly in the beginning.
Yeah, I never thought she looked like a cartoon. I just thought she was pretty. But, I was a little lesbian growing up outside Philadelphia, so what did I know? But to just sort of continue this for a little bit, you spend a few pages on long-standing rumors that Dolly and her best friend, who's like her body woman from high school onward, there were a lot of rumors about them having a relationship too. And in a way, it seems to speak as much to Carl's absence from the tours. Like, he's at home running the asphalt business and living his life. She's out on the road, and she's got her best friend who is there for company and to run things and so on. But there were rumors that the two of them were
Judy Ogle met Dolly when they were in the third grade, and they were both kind of cut from the same cloth as many of the young kids were in that very poor, pinched mountain towns around Sevierville. And they just clicked. They recognized something in each other. I spoke to so many people, so many family members and high school teachers and friends from their many, many years together. And not one suggested to me that Dolly and Judy had a lesbian relationship. And I knew I had to confront some of those rumors in the book, and I wanted to analyze that relationship and gather evidence for it, certainly. And Dolly used to talk with Oprah a lot about Oprah's relationship with Gayle King and the kind of similar rumors that circulated about Oprah and Gayle that circulated about Dolly and Judy. And I think it speaks to the fact that as a culture, we don't know how to talk about women's close, sustaining friendships. That it has to be lesbian or they're just friends. We can't talk about the power of women supporting and loving each other, not in a sexual way.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the great tragedies that of our culture in that we only appropriate deep love with romantic, usually heterosexual love. And as you said, Carl wants nothing to do with show business. He traveled with Dolly quite often to performances, especially when she made movies. He liked doing that. He is not a man who is never around. That is a great misconception. He was around, but he didn't want anything to do with that. Traveling around, going Hollywood, all that sort of thing. He wanted to stay home. He wanted to be in Nashville. He wanted to go to the auto parts store. He's a very, very regular kind of guy. And so that fueled, some of the rumors. Where is he? We couldn't imagine a man and a woman living like that. First, the guy that recorded Dumb Blonde, the first record producer, a wonderful guy by the name of Fred Foster, that Dolly is very loyal, stays in touch with Dolly all of his life. And he lived near Carl and Dolly. And he said, their relationship may not appear to be what most people would consider a normal marriage. He said, but it works for them. It works for them. And they don't need to answer to anybody. And I finished the book in February of this 2025. And 3 days after I submitted the manuscript, Carl Dean died. And I had to kind of go back in and talk once more about the power of their relationship and that it was unusual. And they got a lot of flack for it too. People wanted them to act a certain way. So back to your question about Judy, I certainly think that Carl's absence lent fuel to the fire for that as well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. And
my opinion in the book is, going back to what I said initially, is that it is a deep and sustaining relationship. And, I really trusted the opinion, and I didn't get any counter opinion to that from people close.
Right. Well, and it seems to me also that view of Judy and Dolly's friendship fits very much into a bigger pattern of Dolly being clear she wants to be firmly attached to her roots at all times, that she needs people around her who are real with her. So she hires a lot of her family members, although she has to learn not to hire them to do things they're not very good at and get them doing things that they actually do well. But that she surrounds herself with people she's known for decades, and that is her entourage.
Yeah.
I just want to toss in my favorite Dolly Parton song is White Limousine, which is about a girl who goes to LA and dreams of being a star. And what she really wants is to pick up her whole family at the airport in a white limousine. And that will be her idea of success, is if she can extend everything she's done to the people she loves.
Yeah.
That sounds very Dolly to me.
Yeah. It is a blessing and a curse that Dolly keeps family and friends close to her. In the early days, she had a family band and they weren't very good, and she, really needed to let some people go, but she has always done that. And again, one of my sources who are very, very close to Dolly, a family member, said that what it is trust. And she feels that she can trust people like Judy, obviously. She said, the source told me it's like a root that joins them together. And she knows what that is. And so many people out to exploit you or to, do things that are not in your best interest. Right. She really relies on that. And that was one of the motivations for her founding Dollywood. Or I should say rebranding Dollywood. It was a theme park and she rebranded it. And that she wanted to provide employment for family and friends.
And it really sort of lifted up that community economically too. You make that point, and I think it's very, very important that she's able to. And it's an interesting model for uplift, is to be able to extend opportunities for people to make their own money, to enhance local businesses that already exist, that people have worked hard to establish.
Right.
So, Martha, you interviewed a bunch of people for this book. You did a ton of research. You were not able to talk to Dolly. Is that just part of her being private, that she politely turned you down?
Yeah, well, never. We've reached out to Dolly a number of times. Dolly's people, I should say. She does have layers around her. I thought, times we were pretty close to snagging. But Dolly hasn't done a sit-down substantive interview for quite a long time. I think since Dolly Parton's America. Do you remember that wonderful?
I do. I do.
Podcast series, and that came out in 2019, so that was probably done in 2018, something like that.
Right.
She deals mainly these days with, filming recorded statements, that kind of thing. Yeah, I was disappointed. Wasn't exactly surprised. But I don't know. It may go back to the privacy thing. One of the major themes in the book is the way that Dolly handles her privacy. That she has the appearance of being, so forthcoming and honest, and she certainly is honest. I'm not countering that, but she has a way of ducking, and using humor so that people come away and they feel like they've had, wonderful kind of interaction, or seeing her on stage when she's talking personally about something. And then you realize she hasn't said a thing, Right. She's just used that bob and weave.
Right.
So effectively. I really respect that.
Right.
Her mother told her, always keep something to yourself. It may go back to religion, that there are some things that are sacred, that are not fodder, that are not for the public. And the older Dolly gets, she'll be 80 in 2026. I think that has become even more important. Just think about, the health crisis that Dolly has had. She canceled appearances at Dollywood. She canceled a residency in Las Vegas that was supposed to happen now in December of 2025. Have you heard one thing about what is going on? No.
Yeah, right.
Not
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I would also just sort of say there's a bigger context for this, which is Nashville, in which stars are simultaneously accessible and not accessible. I mean, I remember going to my first Reba McEntire concert, and it was somewhere in deepest, darkest Connecticut. And fans would come up to the stage with flowers as she was singing. And they would hold these flowers up to her, and she would graciously accept the flowers in the middle of a song, hand them off to someone else, smile at them. I mean, it was, and, again, when I went to the Grand Ole Opry last summer, it was during, what is it called? Country Con or something like that. It's the week before the CMAs. And they have name artists all over town giving free concerts. And, after a set, they'll come down into the crowd and give away their picks and stuff like that. So there is a kind of intimacy to Nashville that has to be countered with a kind of self-protection as well, right?
Yes, with security, certainly.
Yeah.
I think it was Minnie Pearl who said, and I'd never thought about this before, that country performers don't perform behind a curtain or a scrim or anything, like the Grand Ole Opry. You just come right on out, and that's significant metaphorically as well. And they have to be very careful. I mean, Dolly has had death threats. There have been bomb threats. You do have to protect yourself. There are always loony bins out there. And yet Dolly doesn't live in a fortress.
Right.
You can drive by her house in Brentwood, and it is not fortified, but you're right. You have to be very, very careful about the way in which you make yourself accessible.
Right. Well, it's a wonderful book. I loved reading it. There's so much in it I didn't know, and I thought I knew everything about Dolly because I'm such a fan. So listeners, there's going to be a link so you can pre-order this book, and pre-ordering is really, really important. We authors know that the more pre-orders you have, the more your press gets behind you. So please go and pre-order this book. You're going to love it. Here's my last question, Martha, which is, why should our listeners read this book right now in this historical moment? What are they going to learn from Dolly that they can take out into the world?
Well, Dolly is often called the great unifying figure, that she attracts so many different kinds of people. And going back to my point about I write books about women who have changed America, certainly Dolly changed the face of country music by broadening it and by bringing in more and more diverse listeners and fans. Certainly she is a model of philanthropy. For those who are lucky enough to have something to give back, she certainly does that. She's not about maintaining riches. As a business person, providing, as we were talking about, all those jobs for East Tennessee, that is quite significant. But I think the most significant thing about Dolly Parton is her character, is her openness, her integrity, her generosity, her kindness. And I think that will be one of her lasting legacies. And in this particular moment, I think it's particularly important to think about kindness. And when Dolly talks about returning to her roots, she talks about returning to certain principles, and that kindness and compassion and generosity is certainly at the very center.
Martha, thank you so much. I agree with you completely about Dolly. And the only thing you left out is she's got a voice like an angel. So, listeners, I can't use any of Dolly's music on this podcast because that would be infringing on her copyright. But I'm going to leave some links. If you're not familiar with her music, you should be. I'm going to leave some links to YouTube's. And Martha Ackman, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us about the wonderful, amazing Dolly Parton.
Thanks so much, Blair. I appreciate it.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow us on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Grass Stains by Andy Ellison. You can find his work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.